President for Asia here at CSIS, and also professor at Georgetown University, where I am Director of Asian Studies. And we're very pleased today to have a distinguished speaker, Dr. Lobsang Sangay, President of the Central Tibet Administration. Dr. Sangay is Sikyong, the democratically elected leader of the Tibetan people and political successor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama of Tibet. In an unprecedented election among all of the diaspora, he was elected for the first time in 2011 and then won re-election in a contested democratic process in 2016. He's now in his second term. He was born in 1968 and grew up in a Tibetan settlement near Darjeeling in India. He received his BA and LLB from Delhi University and joined the Tibetan Youth Congress in 1992 as the youngest executive member. And then he spent a lot of time at a small school in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Harvard, where he was politically active, but also received an award-winning dissertation, a PhD with a dissertation on the Tibetan situation called Democracy in Distress. Is Exile Polity a Remedy? And it was a case study using his legal training, his social science training, and his actual experience in the Tibetan movement on Tibet, winner of the very prestigious Yongsi Kim Prize as the best dissertation. We're going to hear from Dr. Lobsang Sangay some opening remarks, and then I'm going to join him and ask a few questions, then we'll open it up for your questions. I should have mentioned at the outset, I believe that we had a video for you on emergency procedures, and all you need to know is that if we do have to evacuate for any reason, I will tell you where to go, and it's basically out that way. And we would assemble around the corner at the National Geographic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lobsang Sangay.
Thank you, Mike, for the kind introduction, and to CSIS for hosting me here. And I would like to acknowledge Representative Nguru Siringla from the Office of Tibet here in DC and our staff, and some of our old friends, including Michael and others, are here. So thank you very much. And I'm flying back to India, so I just had burger for lunch, and I'm too stuffed. And if I doze off, so Mike says, it's the fault of the burger, American burger, which we don't get in India, by the way. The title, I think, is Reincarnation in Tibet and Religious Freedom. But then I was told that, in the audience, some might know quite a lot about Tibet and others might not. And then the dilemma is, should I get into a really comprehensive, substantive, philosophical discourse on Buddhism and reincarnation? She's saying yes, but I think half the audience will fall asleep, So what I'll do is briefly touch on what reincarnation is and the practices and what Dalai Lama means for Tibet and Tibetan people and what the Chinese government is trying to do as far as reincarnation is concerned. And then, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. On July 6th is His Holiness' birthday. And in Delhi, I met a journalist who said, well, tomorrow I'm going to Tibet. And the Chinese government, allowed 9 of them to visit Tibet for 1 week. And he wanted to touch base, and we didn't have much time. And then after 1 week, they came, and in all 9 newspapers of India, the headline was, Reincarnation of Dalai Lama is Chinese government business. India should not interfere. If so, you will pay a price. So they quoted a vice minister of communication and the director of a major Tibet-related think tank. How can you invent or can do something like that? You get 9 journalists for 7 days and have 9 headlines on the same day on reincarnation. So that shows that the Chinese government is already on its way to dominate the narrative and essentially, succeed as they plan to in finding the next Dalai Lama. And then if you read news media, you find that even major international newspapers, writing about journalists being taken to Potala Palace, which is the winter palace of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and then they write about reincarnation and then the Chinese plan. And they often quote what they call golden urn, in which they put names of the reincarnated lamas, and they'll pick one, that's the reincarnation. That's as though that process is legit. So the narrative is already on. Just a few days ago, around 100 or so monks or reincarnated lamas in Tibet, in Lhasa, were given a couple of days of workshop on reincarnation. And one or two Tibetan lamas were quoted in Chinese media. Again, these quotes could be, fake quotes, or they are attributed without the knowledge. And they say, wow, we are enlightened about the Chinese government plan and understanding of reincarnation system. So they're making few Tibetans say about or validate Chinese plan or their method of reincarnation. Now, it all started in 2007. Chinese government issued a document called Order Number 5, which said that any reincarnated Lama should be recognized essentially by the Communist Party. Then only he or she will be reincarnated Lama. Can you imagine a Communist Party is a declared atheist organization, is saying, we will select all the reincarnated Lamas. It's Order Number 5. And it says the attribution of reincarnated Lamas are, of course, one should be a religious person, but then one should also work towards social harmony of China and politically correct. And obviously, at that time, socialism with Chinese characteristics was not there. Otherwise, they would have put that line too. So since 2007, they have a list of recognized reincarnated Lamas. So it started with 300 something, and interestingly, by April of 2017, it was around 600 something. By August, it jumped to 1,300 something. So Chinese government, Communist Party of China, has validated or recognized 1,300 plus reincarnated Lamas in Tibet. They are the legit ones. And in that same Order Number 5 says, no Lama should have affiliation with foreign organization or Dalai Lama's clique. Now, to be associated with Dalai Lama, it's illegal. Now, in this 1,300 some Lamas, valid reincarnated Lamas, the one name that's missing is the Dalai Lama himself. But they want to find his reincarnation. You can see the contradiction. However, I just want to say that reincarnation is a Tibetan invention. We invented it. This is a unique Tibetan tradition. I know China is the manufacturing hub of the world. They produce a lot of things. They make a lot of duplicates. But as far as reincarnation is concerned, they have zero chance. Because we invented it on 4,000 meters high, and Beijing cannot do anything about it. Because it's very unique. It's only in the Tibetan Buddhist world, the practice of reincarnation. Now, it started, the reincarnation school, or the practice started in the 13th century. The first reincarnated Lama was the Karmapa. So he's the 17th now. Right? Now, Dalai Lamas, we have 14. Having said that, I'm sure there are many women in the audience, in general public, you might be interested to know, are there women reincarnated Lamas or not? Again, it's true, there is. In fact, there are. In 15th century, something Pagodroma was recognized as the female reincarnation. Now, in Tibet, we have the 10th female reincarnated woman reincarnation. So we have both male and female too. So now I don't want to get deep into the philosophical Buddhist explanation because some might find it too deep and fall asleep, but some might find it helpful. But essentially, when I talk about reincarnation, I think you fall into two categories. Are you a believer or not? If you're not a believer, then no matter what or how much you explain, you won't believe. But if you're a believer, then reincarnation is the real deal. But as far as Tibetans are concerned, for the last many centuries, we have embraced reincarnation as a real thing. Now, particularly with the Dalai Lamas, we believe that Tibet is a land of Buddha of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. So Chinese Sea is the Tibetan name for Buddha of compassion. Chinese Sea and Tibet are inseparable. That's what we believe. If you study nation and nationality and nationhood, myth or legend is an essential component of idea of a nation. So for us, Buddha of compassion, Chinese Sea is the myth, is the legend. For us, is the real deal. Similarly, Dalai Lamas are the manifestation of Buddha of compassion for us. Hence, Dalai Lamas and Tibetan people are also inseparable. So for us, Dalai Lama symbolizes Tibetan civilization, Tibetan nation, Tibetan nationality, and Tibetan identity. And for us, finding the reincarnation of Dalai Lama is very important. So first, Dalai Lama was a great religious scholar. I'll run down all the 14 Dalai Lamas quickly. But fourth Dalai Lama was a Mongolian. He was a great-grandson of Altan Khan, who was also great-grandson of Genghis Khan, all that. And sixth Dalai Lama was of Mempa origin. Now it's part of India. So we have Mongolian and Indian Dalai Lamas also. But there's always this question. The historians always ask this question, can Dalai Lama be an American, or a Spanish, or Italian, or Indian? He always says, could be, and then some also ask, can next Dalai Lama be a woman? He also says, could be. Then the news headlines always is, next Dalai Lama will be a Spanish, next Dalai Lama will be a woman. Actually, people forget that he's getting into this Buddhist dialectic discourse. When you say, is it possible? He's saying, yes, it's possible. But as far as next Dalai Lama is concerned, His Holiness has made it very clear. In 1969, it is for the Tibetan people to decide. And it makes sense. We have 14 Dalai Lamas. Why? Tibetan people wanted the Dalai Lama to come back. So from 1st to 5th to 7th to 13th, we always went back and said, please come back. Because Buddha of compassion, Chinese Sea, and Tibet are inseparable. Dalai Lamas and Tibetan people are inseparable. We want you to come back. So 14th have come back. Now 14th has said in 1969, it is for the Tibetan people to decide. Hence, Tibetans will be meeting in October. Tibetan community leaders from all over the world. And there, I think we will express our views, whether we want the Dalai Lama or not. And obviously, it will be resoundingly yes. Because as I said, Dalai Lama's institution of Dalai Lama, and particularly this present Dalai Lama, is very, very important as far as Tibetan movement are concerned. So now the Chinese government, as per Order Number 5, that's what they're planning to do, to have their own Dalai Lamas. And then some people, make this logic, rational-based argument that there will be 2 Dalai Lamas and there will be a lot of chaos or problem or crisis or confusion. But as far as Tibetans are concerned, there is no confusion. Because there will be Tibetan-recognized Dalai Lama and Chinese-recognized Dalai Lama. Now, if, let's say, Fidel Castro is to recognize a pope and tells all the Catholics to say, hey, this is my pope, will you follow him? How many Catholics will follow that pope? And it's, again, it's nothing new. Actually, if you study Vatican and the history of popes, there were many what they call anti-pope or fake popes in the history of Vatican. They never last long. It's always the Catholic themselves, the religious people, they ultimately devote and follow the real Pope. I think during the Ottoman Empire, they tried to impose a priest or a Pope over the Greeks. But the Greeks always followed their own Pope. Right? I think the main church of the Greek Orthodox is in Constantinople, actually. But the Greeks always followed their own Pope. Similarly, Chinese government will try, but they will not succeed. Why I say this is because as far as Chinese government is concerned, if you look at the track history on religious freedom and Buddhism, it's pretty clear. The ultimate goal of China is to convert or force or make Tibet into a Chinese territory and make Tibetans into Chinese. And first thing that they did after the invasion of Tibet was to demolish and destroy Tibetan monasteries and nunneries. As far as late Panchen Lama is concerned, he submitted a document called 70,000 characters, which Mao Zedong labeled it as poison arrow. And that document, this is very important, he submitted it in 1963. Based on the document, 98% of monasteries and nunneries were destroyed. 99.9% of monks and nuns were disrobed. That is the contribution of the Chinese government. A government, a communist party, that destroys 98% of monasteries and nunneries and disrobes 99.9% monks and nuns, it comes back and says, well, we will recognize your reincarnation, we will appoint your Lama you should follow. What kind of credibility do they have in the eyes of the Tibetan people? They don't. Now, even now, Yachingar, even today as we speak, with 5,000 to 6,000 nuns, was demolished. There's a picture. You can Google it. And half the nunnery was reduced, not just to rubbles. There's a fake grass over half the area where there used to be nunneries. 3 nuns committed suicide. Larungar, with 10,000 plus monks, mainly monks, some nuns, was also destroyed. 50% of the concrete buildings are being destroyed. And what did the Chinese government do? They built their own building to host 200 or so Communist Party members to manage the Larungar monastery. Now this, and then in all the monasteries in Tibet, they have something called Democratic Management Committee with Communist Party members who will control ins and outs of the monastery, meaning who gets recruited, who joins as a monk or not, will be decided by the very democratic sounding, a Democratic Management Committee. So this is the track record. Even now, the monasteries and nunneries are destroyed. And how can Tibetan people believe and trust and follow the Chinese government line that they have the final authority on the Dalai Lama? Which is simply unacceptable. But they're trying. And then we are pretty sure that Tibetan people in Tibet will not follow that. And let me end with a story of an Indian journalist who went to Tibet, and there was a Chinese woman who was selling posters of all kinds of leaders, Chinese leaders and others. So she was asked, how come you are not selling a poster of Chinese government-recognized Panchen Lama? And she said, am I stupid? I'm a businesswoman. If it sells, I sell. If it doesn't sell, why should I sell a poster? So the Chinese government did recognize their own Panchen Lama, but he's not accepted by the Tibetan people at large. So his poster is not selling, and the Chinese woman also is saying, I'm a businesswoman. If it sells, I sell. So they have already failed in their effort to have a Panchen Lama. Panchen Lama is considered the second most popular or well-known Lama in the Tibetan business world. So they have already failed, and if they tried again, they are bound to fail. Ultimately, religion and spirituality is a matter of heart and mind. You cannot force someone to follow a particular religion or particular God. You cannot buy someone to follow a particular God or particular church. It has to be from within. And as far as Tibetan people are concerned, for hundreds of years, Dalai Lamas have been the symbol of our civilization, symbol of our nation, symbol of our identity, and we are inseparable. Hence, 15th Dalai Lama will come, and 16th, 17th will come, and it will always be recognized by the Tibetan people, and he will always be the manifestation of Buddha in Tibet. Thank you very much.
That was a powerful window into the politics and the soul of what we're talking about. Some of you may have been here, but 10 years ago at CSIS, we had the honor of hosting His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, together with the Brookings Institution and the Asia Society. Our Chinese friends were not happy. We received, all three institutions received dire warnings, but proceeded anyway. And if you were there, you would have heard His Holiness explain how powerful the spirituality is, even in the face of the most determined and resourced regime. And he told the story of how Li Peng, the premier who presided over the crackdown on Tiananmen, in his old age, converted to Tibetan Buddhism. This was revealed in a book by Li Peng's driver. And
Taozian.
yes,
Most likely Taozian.
yeah, Taozian, excuse me. And one of the people on stage asked His Holiness how to explain it. He said, look, when you're almost 90 years old and thinking of what comes next, socialism with Chinese characteristics, it's not so useful. I was in Mongolia much of August and had a very real lesson on this as well. If you've been to Mongolia, estimates are 90% of Mongolians are Buddhist and look to the Dalai Lama as the most important spiritual leader. Buddhism was outlawed in Mongolia for over 70 years under the Soviet domination period. And as soon as democracy came, as soon as it came, it flourished again to the point where estimates are 90% of Mongolians are Buddhists. And when you go into a Mongolian monastery, prominently displayed in every single one is a picture of His Holiness. And the Beijing has also punished Mongolia for hosting His Holiness and has warned that if Mongolia does not recognize Beijing's choice of the Dalai Lama, there will be serious consequences. So I asked average Mongolians, I was there several weeks, and not one of them that said, we can't even possibly, of course we're not going to listen to Beijing's choice. So the spiritual power that Dr. Lobsang Sangye described is quite potent. I wanted to ask about a couple of quick things before we open it up. In particular, the so-called middle way, which is the strategy His Holiness endorsed for trying to work with Beijing on real autonomy for Tibet, but within the context of the Chinese constitution, modeled at one point on one country, two systems, which seems like the right approach for a peaceful way forward. But one country, two systems is now in great doubt as we see what's happening in Hong Kong, as we see how China is pressing Taiwan, and also, of course, there's no substantive dialogue with you or His Holiness or any of his representatives. So my question is, is the middle way still the right way? And how do you explain it to the diaspora, to the Tibetan people, that it's still the right way? And how do you explain it to Beijing? What's the message for Beijing to recognize that this was and remains the right way?
First, let me answer your second question. Yes, what you see in Hong Kong is very disturbing, and it's a regression of one country, two system. So what was promised in the basic law for Hong Kong, So, and some Tibetans are saying, given the fact that there is a regression of freedom in Hong Kong, can we trust the Chinese government that if granted, genuine autonomy is granted to Tibetan people, will they implement it properly or not? By the way, middle way approach means that this is a win-win proposition for the Chinese government and the Tibetan people. So His Holiness envisioned this, and this is our formal policy, which is to seek genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people within the framework of the Chinese constitution. So what we are saying is we will remain within China and within the framework of the Chinese constitution if the Chinese, the government implement their own laws. So that is, and then we will not seek separation from China. So that's the middle way. So this is a win-win proposition for the Chinese government. But, again, when we propose a middle way approach, we are not doing this because we can fully trust the Chinese government. They will, implement all the promises they make. And the fact that the protests happening in Hong Kong clearly demonstrate that, there can be regression also. But also in 1951, 17-point agreement was also signed between the Chinese government and the government of Tibet, which was actually the original one country, two system, which promised that the authority and status of Dalai Lama will not be changed, and then even for religious freedom, the monasteries' land and their authority will not be changed. But then from 1951 till 1959, for 8+ years, what we saw was the breakdown of that 17-point agreement, and all the provisions in the 17-point agreement were violated, and His Holiness Dalai Lama felt that it's better to flee or leave Tibet and escape to India than remain in Tibet. So we have been through that. But the middle way approach is a win-win proposition because we pursue nonviolence. And once you pursue nonviolence, dialogue is the only way through which you can come to a negotiated settlement. And you have to talk to the Chinese government. And Chinese government says, one China policy cannot be compromised. Sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot be negotiated. So these are their conditions. So then you have to go halfway and say, okay, these are your conditions. His Holiness Dalai Lama said, we accept those conditions, provided we are granted genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people. Now, whether it will work out or not, whether there will be regression or progression, once genuine autonomy is granted, is to be seen. But middle way still is the better policy for us. As a strategy, I think it's quite good, because if not middle way, then the only option left is independence or separation. Then once you do that, then you clearly violate or challenge one China policy, sovereignty and territorial integrity. And if you look at the situation in Taiwan, the president of Taiwan cannot visit Washington, D.C. because the Chinese government says, they seek separation, and as per one China policy, visit to Washington, D.C. will be in violation of one China. Hence, even American government, which is selling arms to Taiwan, which has, recently they have the Tibet Policy Act was passed, but still cannot allow the president of Taiwan to visit DC or Brussels or New Delhi. But as far as Xizhou is concerned, in my position, I could visit.
Anytime.
Anytime. Because why? We follow middle way policy and we follow nonviolence, So as a strategy, I think it's quite good.
Maybe you can explain to the audience, I recognize in the audience some real experts on Tibet, Tibetan Buddhism, China, but maybe you can explain to the audience how broad the presence of followers of His Holiness of Tibetan Buddhists are, because it's well beyond the Tibet Autonomous Region. It's Mongolia, of course, it's northern India, and maybe you could tell, this is an issue of importance to people of deep spirituality well beyond the TAR, and how far?
That's true, because I ended on a very pessimistic note, because all the destruction that I talked about. But let me also share a story of revival. It's true, 98% of Tibetan monasteries and nunneries were destroyed, 99% of monks and nuns were disrobed. So Buddhism as we knew it, as a faith, as civilization, was physically destroyed in Tibet, and you cannot see it. It's a fact. So I'm sure Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and they celebrated and said, yes, we destroyed everything, we succeeded, communism prevailed, and raid prevailed over Tibet, other kind of raid, because Hmong groups, it's also raid, right? The communism kind of raid prevailed over Tibet, they won. But in 60 years, His Holiness Dalai Lama had, normally you always say, what's your plan B? His Holiness said, plan A, B, C, D, E, and F. He said, yeah. Plan A, rebuild all those major monasteries and nunneries among the exiled Tibetans in India. And we did that. We have rebuilt all the major monasteries and nunneries in India, thanks to the Indian government and Indian people. Plan B, particularly rebuild and revive Buddhist civilization in the whole of Himalayan belt. Because His Holiness was thinking, because whether we are there or not, ultimately, from Sikkim to Arunachal to Nepal to Bhutan to Ladakh, they can cross over the mountain, they're in Tibet. So if you revive Buddhism in the Himalayan belt, even if everything is destroyed in Tibet, they can cross over and revive Buddhism, in decades to come. So now if you go to the whole of Himalayan belt, you see Buddhism prevalent, and photographs of His Holiness Dalai Lama it's everywhere. In fact, a Ladakhi minister told me in 1960s, they were demoralized. They were not, in fact, had this inferior complex. They thought they were not good enough. The people said you are backward, and you are Buddhist, it's not good enough. But His Holiness came back again and again and again and introduced Buddhism and told them, and then now they take pride, sense of identity, so very proud. So plan B succeeded now. Plan C was to spread Buddhism all over the world. Buddha came, but he could not travel to all 5 continents. His Holiness did, and set up Buddhist centers all over the world, so that all the Buddhist Lamas and their followers will take American Airlines and fly to Beijing, to Lhasa, and revive Buddhism back in Tibet. So there was Plan C. And the Plan D was to revive Buddhism back in Tibet. So hundreds and thousands of monks or students and teenagers came to exile. We taught them in exile monasteries, nunneries, and they went back. Illegally, they crossed over the mountain. Illegally, they crossed back, and they've been teachers. And Buddhism is back in Tibet now. As I said, as I gave you the example, Larungar with 10,000+ monks and nuns, and Yashingar, 5,000-6,000 nuns, right? All these were rebuilt and revived back in Tibet. Now, the government policy is to destroy and demoralize. But in the social private space, Tibetans have embraced Buddhism like the Mongolians did. So Buddhism is back in Tibet in full force. And Plan E was to revive Buddhism back in China, because that's the safest bet, right? No matter how much they destroy it, if you have a reservoir of Buddhists in China, they will come and they will revive Buddhism in Tibet. Now, China has become, oddly, the largest Buddhist country in the world. 300 million to 400 million Chinese are Buddhists. So there are more communists, there are more Buddhists than the Communist Party members of Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping has 82 million members, but Buddhists, we have 300 to 400 million Buddhists in China. And for them, Tibet is an exotic place. That's why, 90+% of tourists going to Tibet are Chinese from mainland China. So hence, His Holiness Dalai Lama succeeded in Plan A, B, C, D, and E. And final plan, Plan F, is to revive Nalanda Buddhism in India, and he is working on it, and he will succeed there too, because in India used to be a Buddhist country. Now the presence of Buddhism in 1901 was only 0.01% of the population in India was Buddhist. Now it's 11%. So this is where he's working hard to revive Nalanda tradition. So, spiritually, we have already won over Chinese government and the Communist Party, right? Now, politically, they occupy our territory, and we have to revive our political freedom also, and we are very confident that we will prevail, primarily because our civilization is 2,500+ years old, and communism is 100+ years old. So there was never a competition to begin with, and we have already won the spiritual front. And as far as reincarnation of Dalai Lama or any other incarnation will be determined and decided by the Tibetan people, and we will prevail.
That was fascinating.
And then you're right. Mongolia is a Buddhist, and the chief priest of Mongolia also is Dalai Lama, and the 3 republics in Russia, Kalmyk, Tuba, and Bureth, are also, Buddhist, and they follow Tibetan Buddhism.
So in Beijing, people would hear this, and some people in the PLA would be lighting up the threat map. But wiser heads would think pushing down on Lhasa and the Tibetan Autonomous Region only creates more pressure in China and around the world for recognition of Tibet's real autonomy.
You mentioned the story of Tao Ziyang. Right?
Yeah.
He was the Secretary General of the Communist Party of China. So just before he passed away, we received a message from one of his children to His Holiness Dalai Lama to pray for him. And then obviously His Holiness prayed, and thinking that is one of the children requesting a prayer by His Holiness for Tao Ziyang. Later, the thank you note came that Tao Ziyang in his dying bed was mentioning His Holiness' name.
Yeah.
So the Secretary General of the Communist Party of China was mentioning His Holiness' name in his deathbed. Clearly, Buddhism is prevalent in China. So there's a joke that during daytime, all the Communist Party generals and leaders, they go to attend party meetings, and their wives are in Buddhist monasteries praying for their promotion, maybe no demotion, or don't get caught in corruption, things like that, right? So Buddhism is prevalent even within the compound of Zhongnan High, the leadership compound. So that way, I think, I think as far as His Holiness' vision has succeeded in many ways.
So this is also a power game that involves nation states. And the United States is one of the only states that can actually take the pressure from China politically on this issue. Mongolia, for example, had trade essentially cut off briefly after admitting His Holiness a few years ago. European countries have come under enormous pressure, as you know. Right now, the U.S. has the Tibet Policy Act, and there's talk on the Hill of updating the Tibet Policy Act. And in general, there's pretty strong bipartisan support for Tibet. When our friend Lodi Gary passed away and the memorial service was held for him on Capitol Hill, the turnout on a bipartisan basis was just phenomenal. So there's a lot of support for Tibet in the Hill, but and I know you're not here to tell us what to do, but maybe you can give us some hint. What would you like to see the U.S. do to reinforce the efforts that you are making, that His Holiness is making for the people of Tibet and for all Buddhists?
The U.S. is definitely an exception, where support for Tibet is bipartisan, still very strong. Politically, I think the U.S. does the most for Tibetan people. For example, today we are having a talk here in Washington, D.C., and it's well attended. I was giving a talk in Stellenbosch Law School in Cape Town, South Africa. 100 protesters came, of which 70 or so were labor migrants from neighboring country hired by Chinese embassy, and 30 or so Chinese from every, I think, Chinese restaurants and hotel, whoever there, they were brought there. And when they roamed the campus of a small law school, and 100 people, and you can clearly sense the tension. And the second time when I went to give a talk, they said we can't do it because the pressure is so much from within the government and the board of trustees of the university to host such kind of a talk. And the African labor migrants, they didn't know what to protest. They were hired, right? They got KFC chicken and posters and money to protest, and they were singing "Ole, Ole, Ole," that song. They were watching a football match, soccer match, So here in DC, you can have this kind of talk. In the last 8 years, I've been to many, many capitals, including in Europe. Think tanks, academics, politicians, they shy away. The Chinese pressure is real, and Europe is divided now. They have 16 plus 1 countries. Europe has around 42 or 43 European countries. European Union has 28 members, but 16 countries, I think 7 or 8 from the European countries and 7 or 8 from the European Union itself. Plus 1 is China. They form a group, 16 European countries plus 1 China within Europe. So Europe, foreign policy, European Union foreign policy is, normally decided based on consensus. There can never be consensus when 16 countries on the other side. So you can go from capital to capital. You can clearly see the Chinese government pressure. But in the last 2 or 3 years, it's changing now. There's a bit of a bias remorse in, let's say, in Australia, Japan. We should shy away from mentioning even Tibet. Let's say 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Now Japan has the largest Tibet support parliamentary group in the whole world, 92 members of parliament, of which 60 to 70% are from the ruling party. Czech Republic has 51 members of parliament, the largest in Europe. So that way, I think there is this bias remorse, relook or review at China's policies, their hardline policies, their way of what they call assertive diplomacy is being watched and followed. Even in India, this morning I got a call for me to the chief guest to this major Hindu organization. They have a major international event, and I'm invited as chief guest. So my other minister is going, but there's another one on September 20th. Even in India, in schools now you'll see students pledging their allegiance for India and freedom for Tibet in high schools. So this kind of debate and discussion is taking place in various parts of the world. This is a major change in the last 2-3 years. And for example, in Germany also, German Bundestag, for the first time I had a hearing after a long time on Tibet on May 8th. So these things are happening all over the world. So that's a major change. Now, as far as U.S. government is concerned, U.S. Congress passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, which was signed by President Trump. Now it's a law. Now I'm here mainly to push for Tibet Policy Act, which was passed in 2002. It's already an act. It's a law and a policy of the U.S. government on Tibet. Now we are revising it and updating it because it's 17 years old, and we are putting a lot of issues, including religious freedom, reincarnation, environmental issues, and other democracy of the Tibetan community, all that. And so yesterday there was a reception hosted by the Democratic Partnership Committee in the U.S. Congress, and around 10 U.S. Congress members came, and ultimately, finally, Speaker herself, Nancy Pelosi, came and lent her support. She didn't have to come. She's very busy. She is a well-known Tibet supporter, but she made the time to come after all the voting took place to show her support, and we hope to pass that act, at least definitely in the House. And if there are some staff members here from the Senate side, do nudge your senators to co-sign the bill, and it will be, I think, tabled this week. And hopefully we'll have Tibet Policy Act by the end of this year.
It's a encouraging trend because I think from 2009, the political trends around the world on the Tibet question were not favorable for His Holiness. Beijing was quite successful for a while there at isolating smaller countries that had supported His Holiness and punishing them. But it's reversing, as you point out. And I think in the U.S., on a bipartisan basis in the Congress, as I said, support is quite strong. Why don't we take some questions? We have microphones. If you could briefly introduce yourself and keep the questions brief, I'd appreciate it. But I'd be very happy to take questions. We have about 10 or 15 minutes still. Where are our microphones? Okay. Questions? Yes, why don't we start here in the middle?
Thank you very much, Mr. Sengay. My name is Shunji Shibe with NHK, Japan Broadcasting Corporation. So since you become Shikyon, the political leader of Tibet, so how have you tried to approach the Chinese authority? And is there any meaningful approach from Chinese authority or President Xi to the Tibetan government? Thank you.
As you mentioned, late Lori Gary was the special envoy of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And from 2002 to 2010, they had 9 rounds of dialogue with the representative of the Chinese government. So it's not like we never talked, we did. There were 9 rounds of formal dialogue. But then there was no breakthrough. So the final dialogue was in January of 2010. And hence now it's been 9 years. There has been no meeting with the envoys of the Dalai Lama and the representative of the Chinese government. So there's no formal dialogue. Since Xi Jinping came to power, the situation in Tibet has gone from bad to worse. Because if you go by Freedom Index, which is published every year by the Freedom House, Tibet is listed as the second least free region in the whole world after Syria for 3 years in a row. So we all know about Syria. Situation is bad. But how many of you knew that Tibet is the second least free region after Syria for 3 years in a row? So the situation is quite bad. So there's no formal dialogue. But informally, Chinese academics, quote-unquote journalists, come and we have dialogue. And we are transparent, we are open, Some Buddhists, they come and meet with His Holiness, and some business, like well-intended people. Some claim to have good Quanxi connection all the way to the top. You will never know. And so informally, discussion takes place all the time, and we are open to it. But there's no formal dialogue.
Good question. Yes, sir. Ma'am, right here. And then I'll get you next. We're going to go here and then to you.
Thank you so much. Extraordinary talk. Two brief questions. Given that there are 300 million Buddhists in China, do you think it's a generational progression where things will eventually change in a positive way, and the Chinese, just from the pressure of the general public, will eventually become more kind and benevolent? And the second thing is, do you really think that the exile and that terrible turbulence on a higher consciousness and spiritual level was almost like a pod full of seeds that expanded and went all over the world, that we all benefited from, where before it was quite a closed society and few people really had access to the teachings? Thank you.
The second question, as you can see, I'm not a monk. I'm a lay person. So I don't know much I can't claim to know much about Buddhism and the scriptures, things like that. But, having, listened to His Holiness Dalai Lama's teachings, I feel maybe I'm biased here. Buddhism could be the religion or spirituality for 21st and 22nd century. That's what I believe, Having said that, because if you look at the history of Buddhism, it's been destroyed time and again by many forces, but it has always come back because it's always an intellectual religion. It's not simply a religion; it's a philosophy. Some can also say science. Hence, I think the fact that it has survived for so long, without having any, like Muslims, they have a Mecca and they have authority, and in Christianity they have church and Vatican. We don't. Buddhism is voluntary. It's a grassroots, bottom-up kind of approach. So I do believe that. And whether it will happen or not is to be seen. Now, Chinese Buddhists, I think it's partly generational, but also historically, China was a Buddhist country during Tang Dynasty. Tang Emperor was Buddhist-leaning emperor. I can't say Buddhist. So it's not surprising that 300 or 400 million Chinese are Buddhists. And also, China is also an interesting place. People always say, will there be changes in China or not? But philosophically speaking, I think there will be changes because the debate that's going on within China is interesting. Because on the one hand, they say it's a communist country, so obviously Karl Marx is the boss of the party. But for all practical purposes, China is a capitalist country. So Adam Smith is there too in that room, right? So a lot of missionaries and Christians are also, spreading their faith. So hence Jesus Christ is also there, And obviously Chinese Confucius, very old sage is also there in that room. And so you can see Karl Marx is there, Adam Smith is there, Jesus Christ is there, right? Confucius is there. They all are discussing. And so which direction should we take, right? And Buddha is saying, well, I have 300 million Buddhists here, I have the most members, right? So I'm sure Mr. Buddha will say, I need lady liberty, democracy to come to China. So in that discourse, I think democracy is inevitable and universal. That's what I feel.
It's an interesting image of the standing committee of the Politburo you just created.
No, they are outside the Politburo.
Yeah. Yes, please, right in the front here.
Thank you. My name's Angelita from the Catalyst Writer. My question, sir, is looking at the dynamics between Tibet, China, and the United States. I mean, with China, still the ruling party is communist. So obviously, I mean, I think they want the Dalai Lama recognized by China more like a figurehead. I mean, and with the United States, my honest question is, I know you want to be recognized by the United States, and interpreting it, maybe you want to align with the United States so you have some buffer against China. I mean, that's how it looks like. But the question is the separation between the church and state in Tibet. Because if you look at the Italian government, there's the head of the Catholic Church. And by the way, just some honest comments, there's a difference between the Catholic Church and between the Dalai Lama and the Pope. But if you look at Italy, I mean, there's a very structured government that relates with the government of the other countries. And with the Dalai Lama, is that like a spiritual leader, a figurehead that you get sympathy from the people? Basically, what I'm trying to say is, I want to see how you perceive your relationship with China and your relationship with the United States as as a church-state leader, something like that.
So in a way, it's a question
Thank
about
you.
your relationship with His Holiness. Because when I was in the White House working for President Bush, His Holiness was fulfilling his role as the Dalai Lama, but also your role you're now playing, and so there is this separation. Maybe you can describe how you relate with His Holiness and the division of roles and labor.
That's true. If you study the institution of Dalai Lama, from 5th Dalai Lama till 14th Dalai Lama, Dalai Lamas were both the political and spiritual leader of Tibet and Tibetan people. But in 2011, His Holiness Dalai Lama separated the church and the state. So normally people fight for and pursue for the separation, right, for power. Let's say the crisis in Syria and Venezuela are the reasons why the leaders, political leaders, are not letting go their authority or power. But His Holiness in 2011 voluntarily, as he says, happily separated the church and the state and said, I'm devolving all his political authority to the elected person, to the elected president, and I happened to get elected at that time. So we have completely separated the church and the state. So this is also His Holiness' vision, his contribution for Tibetan democracy. That we established parliament in 1960, and we had women representation in 1963. I had a few countries in Europe like Switzerland, So, and then in 2001, we had the first direct election of our the executive head. And 2011, he completely separated the church and the state. So His Holiness Dalai Lama is our spiritual leader, and my office is the political head of the Tibetan administration. So we have completely separated.
Yes, ma'am. I think you were next. Luke, right there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. You. In your excellent presentation, you mentioned that there are three Buddhist majority parts of Russia, but I believe that Russia has never allowed the Dalai Lama to visit. That's one question. The other is, how do you relate to the terrible persecutions of China's Muslim population? Thank you.
Good questions.
Yes, His Holiness has visited Russia before, several times, particularly these areas, Kalmyk and Tuba and Buret area. They were not only Buddhists, but they follow His Holiness Dalai Lama as their spiritual leader. And this is not new. This has been Tibetan civilization was Tibetan monasteries was also quite internationalist. So we had Russians and Mongolians and Indians and Nepalese and Bhutanese monks and nuns in Tibet for centuries when we were a free country. So now, in recent years, yes, because of their close relationship with China, His Holiness has not been able to visit Russia. That was the question?
And
China
Xinjiang,
Muslim, that's true.
yeah.
With Xinjiang, with Uyghurs, yes, we are in solidarity with Uyghur people in Xinjiang. Obviously, there are brothers and sisters who are suffering the same fate or similar fate of Tibetans. I've been to many events where we meet, the Uyghurs, the Mongolians, the Chinese dissidents, we all meet. If you close your eyes and listen to their stories, it's almost exactly the same, except for Tibet is replaced by Xinjiang and Xinjiang is replaced by Mongolian. And in last November in Geneva, we organized this Geneva Forum, because there's Human Rights Council in Geneva, right? UN Human Rights Council, where we invited the president of World Uyghur Congress, Dokum Isa, and Wu Kai-shi from Taiwan, the considered as number 4 leader of Tiananmen tragedy, and Chinese dissident, Mongolian, and also activists from Hong Kong and from Taiwan. And this November 13th, 14th, 15th, if anyone's interested, we will be hosting Geneva Forum again in Geneva, where we'll invite all these other activists from different parts of the world or periphery of China to have a common forum. So this is our contribution. Tibetan administration or Tibetan leadership, as per His Holiness vision, we've been acting as their, I don't want to say big brother, but the compassionate brother or sister to all our Uyghur and Mongolian and Hong Kong and Taiwan friends. Of course, Taiwan is for all practical purposes an independent nation, but they also say, how come you have so much support around the world and Taiwan don't? And then we share this forum. And last time I think Wu Kai-shi, he said, yeah, we want to thank Tibetan administration and Tibetan people for leading us, for showing us the path. We provide that forum, and this November we will have that event. So we all are in solidarity, and especially with Hong Kong also, we express our solidarity. What they're pursuing is democracy and basic freedom, and use of violence. I think it's the wrong way to go, and dialogue is the best way to solve the issue of Hong Kong.
So in the think tank rankings, CSIS is proud to claim the spot of #1 for national security. I don't think CSIS is ranked #1 for Buddhist studies in the world, but this has been a fascinating discussion, and it's been a really artful interweaving of the geopolitics, the politics, the spirituality and history, and really a rich discussion for our audience. I want to thank you. I want to thank the audience. We at least I'll speak for myself. This is a dialogue that I hope leaders in China take to heart, because the point here is not to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. The point here is that for China to succeed, for the Chinese people to be fulfilled, these questions of spirituality, of religious freedom, of choice, of a fulfilling life are just not things that the Chinese Communist Party can legislate away. Or deal with by the Hanization of Xinjiang or the Tibet Autonomous Region. Ultimately, what I'm saying is, what your message to us today is powerful, but it's an important message for China, and I hope in a small way at least we've contributed to getting that message across. So please join me in thanking our terrific speaker, Dr. Lobsang Sangay.